Welcome back to Consilience Conversations, Episode 6, Free Will. And back with me again is my esteemed colleague, Dr. Matthew Roos. And with us, our good friend and actually linking friend and special guest is Mr. Daniel Babcock. Welcome, Babcock.
Hello, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm fine.
Well, so when Dr. Roos, when Matt and I first started this series of conversations, these Consilience conversations, one of the topics he explicitly mentioned in the very first meeting that he never wanted to try and tackle was free will because it's such a sticky issue. And what I find so funny about the basis for this conversation is of all the listeners we have, you were the first listener to actually leave us a message, and your message was, in your very first question was about free will. And so eventually Matt just said, we just gotta have this guy on and see what he's got. And well,
we're gonna put this to rest.
I'm obviously not a very good listener.
Yeah, no, we got to put. But I think Matt got it right there. We people have been debating this for thousands of years, but now we've come together in this incredible agora, this new market space, and it's just time to put this issue to rest. And I think we have about 45 minutes here, and that might be a little much for time, so we might have to stretch it out at the end. But we thought we might take a crack at it. So, well, I guess first, Matt, did you want to maybe tell us a little bit about these experiments that you have listed here, the Benjamin Libet experiments from the 80s, the John Dylan Haynes in 2008, and maybe what's changed in the technology between those, and maybe just then Babcock or I can broadly lay out what the free will or the issue with free will traditionally has been, philosophically and literarily. I've also got a text from Dante here. His Purgatorio has some comments on that.
Okay, sure. Yeah, that sounds good. So there's really sort of two different subsets of sort of experiments that I'll try to go through it quickly. And if you guys want to ask me more about them, or we can go into more depth if you like. But so this one here by Benjamin Libet, that's sort of he was the pioneer in this area. And he did a set of experiments in which the subjects effectively just decide when to move their hand or flip their wrist, move their wrist or press a button. I think there are a variety of different types of experiments. But really what the subject does is they make that decision of their own accord when they're going to make that movement. And during that time, they're watching some sort of clock, not necessarily a wall clock, but he actually has some sort of mechanical device in these experiments where there's it's kind of like a wall clock. You see some dot moving around in some sense. It's really an oscilloscope. But in any case, what they're instructed to do, paraphrasing, is just sit there calmly, decide, and when they decide that they're going to make a movement, they're watching this screen, and so they see what the sort of the number or the position is of the clock. And then they make their movement. And then after they make that movement, they report what the clock time was or what the position was when they decided to make that movement. So there's all sorts of problems with this to begin with, because self-reporting is really just, it's sort of ironic that we're trying to talk about a conscious process and whether it's conscious or not, whether it's free will or not, and yet you have to report the time that you decided to make this happen. So in any case, the summary is that in terms of the data that's collected the researchers are recording sort of the electrical potential or the electrical signal that is present above the motor cortex on the outside of the scalp, and that's an electroencephalography signal, or EEG for short. And what he observes is that there is sort of an elevation in the voltage or the signal that is fairly reliably present about half a second before the time at which the subjects actually report that they've made their decision. So it would appear that there's one possibility is that really there's a signal in the brain that indicates that they've made this decision before the subject is consciously aware that they've made that decision. So really that's the whole point. It calls in this question of free will and you guys can take it into what the definition of free will is. And just because I suppose if it's not conscious, then it's not free will, though one might argue you could have unconscious free will. There is a criticism of that experiment, which is that it was just one movement. And there's a lot of different things of what that neural signal could have meant. It doesn't necessarily just mean that they made a decision. It may have been an actual, like a preparation for a movement or planning for a movement or a wide variety of other things, really. But, this experiment has been sort of redone in various ways over the years. And so I cite this one here from John Dylan Haynes in 2008. And it's very similar, except in this case, the subject had two hands and two buttons. And their decision was not only when to initiate the movement, but which button to press. And that allows you to sort of disambiguate the whether it was movement planning versus actual decision making to some degree, because of the fact that the right side of the motor cortex controls the left side of the body, and vice versa. And so the signals are clearly. It doesn't mean they're not still related to some element of movement preparation or action, but it does reduce the probability that we're confusing or conflating these things. And so also in 2008, that experiment, they used fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, rather than this EEG signal. So that's just a much superior technology for these kind of neuroscience experiments. So that's, and effectively those experiments sort of gave similar results. And so it seems that, I guess there's one follow-up thing there, is that, one of the interpretations of that is not only does our unconscious mind sort of make this decision, and only after the fact does our sort of conscious mind become aware of it, our conscious mind also may but the conscious mind believes that we made that decision. So it sort of actually infers from our behavior what the decision was. So, it may almost be like you in retrospect, you believe you did this, but you're really sort of, explaining away, or I shouldn't really use that term, but you are trying to put up, you're sort of unconsciously coming up with an explanation of why your body did what it did without really realizing it. So that's one possibility. And, I also have lists, so I'll leave it at that, except I have, there are a number of criticisms of these experiments. And it's really, and many times these researchers are not making bold statements about this proves that free will does not exist or something. That, they are professional scientists, and they say there's, they put forth a lot of discussion and possibilities and speculation, but the data are what the data are. But there are a lot of questions about what those results really mean, and so it's not clear. And so I don't want to talk too much about it beyond that. It's let you guys maybe pipe in, except we can either pause there, or I can tell you about these other ideas about how there are, the brain is noisy. Neurons are noisy. They sort of, they don't always fire in the same pattern when presented with the same stimuli or when you take the same action. So there are some that speculate that noise, what we call noise, is actually sort of free will in action. That might be some representative, or that it's a little hairy, but we don't understand what that neural noise is, but that neural noise is sort of our free will, the physical evidence for that. On the other hand,
could you define noise?
Yeah, well, that's part of the problem, right? So what one person's noise might be a functional signal or a process within the brain that you just didn't know what it was until you to do enough experiments and work out what that really is. So, but what I sort of mean by noise is what I alluded to before. If an example being, if I'm looking at a screen and your head and eyes focused, head perfectly held in place, and your eyes focusing on the same thing, and you are shown a red dot, I'm just making that up, certain neurons will fire in the visual cortex, or they will be inhibited from firing. And you might do that multiple times over, but those neurons don't respond in exactly the same way every time. Perhaps more important to this discussion, though, it's the same thing if you take a motor action, and maybe just tapping your finger, something very simple that seems like the exact same neural firing pattern would be executed in order to then, of course, stimulate your muscles and make that movement. But it's actually different every time, and that's sort of the noise in the system. The other, I guess I'll dive into this just for another 30 seconds, which is, but more importantly, so that's one element of this. Another element about neural noise actually is about it's related to, in a way, priming and cognitive biases. And under the hood, our brains are sometimes building up and accumulating evidence. So in some experiments where they show they're not related to free will, but I'll make the connection momentarily. If you have sort of a pattern of dots moving across a screen, and these dots, this is a traditional sort of set of visual neuroscience experiments. These dots are blinking on and off, and they're moving at short little durations. And sometimes the dots are not all going in the same direction. They're mostly moving in one direction, but some are going in another direction. So there's sort of a correlation. That correlation isn't 1.0, and may go, and sometimes if the correlation is low, you have to stare at this thing for quite a while in order to perceive what direction the majority of the dots are moving. And so in those experiments, when people have done this in monkeys many times, and they're recording from the neurons, a number of neurons, while they do this, what you see is that sort of the monkey has to make some decision for its tasty juice reward if it does the right thing. And so it sits there and stares at it a while, and you see neurons, sort of sets of neurons building up, and there are like certain firing patterns emerging. But it doesn't happen instantaneously. It takes some time. And so it's essentially accruing information. And then when it sort of, hypothetically hits some sort of threshold, then the monkey is certain enough or feels certain enough that it really believes it knows what direction the dots are moving in the majority, and it makes its decision. So that's very clear. Those experiments have been done pretty thoroughly over a number of years. But there's sort of a speculation that's actually, I mentioned here in this, in the middle part of the criticism section, Aaron Sugar experiment in 2012, the sort of the idea is that even though you're not presented with a stimulus or cued to make a decision, you are still making a decision. And that decision may be there's some internal process that builds up, and it may almost be like a random walk. But once enough of the neurons are firing in one particular manner, and they sort of accumulate, it's not really evidence in this case, but as soon as enough of them are sort of pushing, feeding to other neurons down the line, and they push those ones over some threshold, then an action is made. So part of that is, and there's some other evidence there that's tied into showing that this noise may be, in some sense, part of this decision process, but that doesn't really argue whether it's a conscious or unconscious decision. It's just that, it's particularly in that Haynes study, the evidence is that, even upwards of 10 seconds before the subject believed that they had made a decision, there was some neural evidence that decision had already been made. But that may not be the best interpretation. It may be that it's just building up evidence over those 10 seconds. And that's 10 seconds when you first start seeing this sort of noise increase to the point that it's going to hit eventually this threshold.
Well, that's
okay.
Okay. So I have three things based on that, and a big bridge over to Babcock. Then the first thing I wonder is to what extent that sort of neural buildup theory is related to Haidt's concept of the relationship of like the old brain or elephant to the rider, and that maybe the rider is a manifestation of the process by which, sort of neurons turn on, and then sort of a motor action is then disinhibited after a certain moment, and to what extent that would be related to the temperament of a human. So like different humans, depending on their neuroticism or extroversion or whatever you define approach or withdrawal as, have differing sort of levels or amount of neurons that need to turn on in order for them to engage in that sort of behavior, right? And I was also wondering earlier to what extent the decision might be made by the brain, but it's the conscious will that inhibits or disinhibits the decision. So like maybe what it is you need to do in a situation, but you hesitate or you don't. I was wondering whether that would factor in. The next thing is I want to give some context for free will. It's about the biggest question that exists throughout all epic literature in the West. And in the Iliad is the great question of Achilles: does he have free will to choose to live a short life or a long life? In the Odyssey, it is a question that Odysseus has to ask: would he prefer to be immortal with no choice, or would he prefer to be responsible for his choices and live a sort of a life full of misery? And he chooses the life of misery as the better life. In Virgil, it's a major question for Aeneas, whether he has free will or the wheels of fate are just moving him. And of course, in Dante, the question of free will is brought up in the Purgatorio explicitly, not only here, but in particular here in Purgatorio 16 by a character in the Circle of Wrath or the Terrace of Wrath named Marco Lombardo, where he says, "You who are living, refer every cause upward to the heavens alone, as if they of necessity moved all things with them. If this were so, free will would be destroyed in you. There would be no justice and happiness, for good or grief or for evil." Basically suggesting that the basic concept of Western civilization is if there's going to be a heaven or hell, or you're good or bad, there needs to be free will. It's also the basis of our justice system, right? If you're going to be punished for something, you need to have done wrong. So it is a major practical and philosophical question at the framework of all our literature and philosophy. Just to let people know why we're thinking very hard about this. And I can say more, the heavens initiate your movements. I do not say all of them, but supposing I did say so, a light is given you to know good and evil, and free will, which if it endure fatigue in its first battles with the heavens afterwards, if it is well-natured, it conquers completely. That reminds me a lot of the idea of what you said of the neurons turning on, with the heavens maybe moving you at first, Matt, for sort of his sort of primitive account of what it is you're saying.
Can I add to this as well?
Yeah, please do. And I didn't even mention, I wanted to talk about how the last podcast we did together was Westworld, where the fundamental question asked by the Black Hat is, did he have free will the whole time? And so just to say that this is a major legal, religious, philosophical, literary, neurological, or neuroscientific question. This is the biggest Consilience question possible. All of these fields care about the answer to this question. Yeah.
So the only text I was going to add is Oedipus Tyrannus, which to me, if you think about free will, is the fundamental text.
That's right. That's right.
The question of whether or not he makes decisions. But at the end, at about 1330 or so, when the chorus is asking him, why did he blind himself, right? So the chorus says, "Doer of dreadful deeds, how did you bring yourself so to quench your sight? Which of the gods set you on?" And Oedipus replies, "It was Apollo, my friends, who accomplished these cruel, cruel sufferings of mine, and no other hand struck my eyes but mine own miserable hand. For why did I have to see when there was nothing I could see with pleasure?" In other translations, I believe that they make that the decision was mine, right? The choice was mine. Oedipus makes this claim that all the other terrible things that had happened to him were the gods doing, but the blinding was his own choice.
That's right. And just to give the viewer some context for Oedipus, he is born with a prophecy that he will lay with his mother and kill his father, and so is supposed to be killed by a shepherd who then gives him away to another kingdom where he's raised adopted. He then later hears that prophecy, and not wanting to kill his adopted parents, who he thinks are his real parents, he flees them, meets his father on the road, kills him, and then answers the riddle of the Sphinx at Thebes, and then marries the queen there, who's now widowed, who without asking many questions, marries this man, and that happens to be his mother. And so he sort of lives a lie as this ultimate hero until, again, Apollo sends a plague to Thebes, and he sort of has to unravel what has happened and what he has really been doing. Aristotle calls it the ultimate tragedy because the revelation and the turn of fate happen at the same moment. But so Matt, we have some literary connections here, and we do have some context. But what is it? What have you been hearing us saying that sounds either crazy or interesting or?
Well, I guess there's a few things, but first of all, it's obviously you guys have a deep knowledge of ancient literature or Western literature. Of course, I'm sure we can all agree it's highly likely that these issues were thought of for millennia before recorded history as well. So who knows what they had thought, but maybe from the earliest days of our sort of modern intelligence, these questions were likely on some people's minds. So again, maybe in another 30 minutes we can get this resolved.
Right.
So let me address a couple of your things you said there, Alex, and then something else came to my mind that I would like to get your guys' thoughts on. Yeah. But first of all, you mentioned the elephant and the rider, and how sort of like the elephants are unconscious, and here we are, the rider, and we think we have a lot of control, but we really have very little control. And perhaps the connection to neural noise there would be something like, different people have a different elephant, and just as the neural noise, may drive you to sort of decisions. And it's not to, I don't really like to use the word noise too much because it sounds like it's all random.
Right.
But perhaps different people have sort of different thresholds, right? So that maybe they have a lower threshold when it comes to making some fast decisions or executions. And so whether those decisions are considered to be right or wrong, they are just faster at getting there. They may, or others may have a higher threshold, meaning that it takes them longer to get there, and you might consider them as being more judicious in their decision making. So that's one possible way to look at it.
That just makes me think, just to add in as a footnote, what you think is your consciousness could just be the expression of your sort of neurologically embodied temperament, right? That it makes it both more special and less special to me, that you do not freely choose how it is that you manifest yourself, because you have these differing thresholds, and so that's your temperament and thus who you are. But you will only ever be the thing that you are, built in the way that you are, because the conditions that make you possible and your self-expression possible are impossible to replicate, or at least very, very, very would.
Certainly everyone's going to be unique in that regard.
Right. That's like so when I was doing reading on this, what I'm thinking is that, or what I was thinking is that perhaps this idea of free will is, maybe we're thinking about it incorrectly. That the idea of like there's a single decision that I must make, whether or not to move my finger, and that this is a representative of free will. But really, it's more about the construction of the self that would be the person who would move their finger. I mean, obviously, that's not a moral choice, right? I guess perhaps it is if that finger is moving a trigger on a gun, but that the idea of free will is more larger in scope, I guess, macroscopic rather than microscopic. Does that make sense?
That's right, because it's not that you're just moving a finger; it's that you're a creature motivated by defensive aggression to take violent action against a hostile outgroup creature, and that manifests in its particular form.
Right. I mean, that's what I'm thinking of is, Aristotle's idea of virtue, right? That it's not like one single shot of the arrow; it's the aim of the archer.
Yes, and what I think we're wondering is whether that aim is sort of set neurologically,
right?
And whether that means you're free or not, because I mean, it does mean you're unique. I think, Matt, you nailed it there. That almost seems like the better thing to focus on to me.
I would want to. Sorry, I'll let you finish up there, Alex. But I would make one connection to what Daniel just said in terms of, and maybe this isn't quite what you meant, I'm sure, but back to the neuroscience experiments. One of the criticisms of them is that they are all sort of mundane little tests and decisions that they make, and they are highly constrained by the experimental situation and what they are told to do by the experimenter or the researcher. So it's a far cry from the sort of these are things that they're doing on the order of seconds, if not less, which is a far cry from our decisions that we would like to think that we plan things out, we have goals, we have agendas, and the kind of decisions that we think of, typically under the conversation of free will, are ones that you've spent minutes, hours, years, or a lifetime.
The experiment felt more like response to stimuli, even though it was a choice about which button to push. It still felt more like stimuli response rather than a complex matrix choice.
Well, yeah, I would like that. That would be an interesting aspect to add to an experiment like this, like choices with heavier moral weights or heavier like lifetime outcomes, like choice of college, choice of mate, choice of, as opposed to like choice of where you eat today, or choice of button to press, like ones that had that additional dimension added, whether that would activate different parts of the brain, or we would be able to see something through the longer decision-making process, and whether articulation were a part of it and how that actually affected the decision-making process, because I think that's what the philosophers are really looking for. does the process of articulation and the transmission of information between humans have the potential to change our choices and thus our actions in the world? I think that's another aspect of this question.
Yeah, totally agree. It's just, and of course it would be massively, who knows how one could implement experiments that could measure things with those kind of time scales and those sort of weights to the decision, and what areas of the brain are you going to monitor and with what resolution. So
right.
It's effectively impossible with today's technology. And the researchers recognize this. That's partly why if you're a researcher and these are your data, you're really stepping out on a limb if you try to actually say that this does or does not support free will or determinism. And another, one other thought I had there, I think actually you cued me on this with your initial comments and questions, Alex, is that, conscious, and, another thing maybe, and this is sort of a criticism, is that of these experiments or some interpretation of these experiments, is that you may have, maybe that's your unconscious, mind, or you are not consciously aware that sort of this decision has come about, but that doesn't mean it's not necessarily the conscious mind didn't in some way have a manner of, in the end, actually allowing or stopping this action to be taken. So there's just not enough data there to say that sort of a decision was, or maybe it was like, I should say, a candidate decision was put forth subconsciously, but did it enter the conscious mind with enough at a point in time that you could stop that if you wanted to, or you just allowed it, and that's okay.
So just to clarify, are you talking about like going to a polling booth and you claim you don't know who you're going to vote for, but subconsciously you do? Is there any way to change that subconscious choice you've already made? Would that be an example of what you're talking about?
No, I don't think I think that's an interesting example to potentially discuss. But again, this is related to the fact that this is sort of contrived, very experimental, very short, time to act, and it's very simple in what you're doing. And it's not designed, they do some of this where, sorry to say that they are some types of experiments like this where they actually, the person is instructed to do these things as we just discussed, but occasionally a sound is played or something notifies the subject that they should not do anything. So if they were just about to do it, they get a cue and it stops them. So, or they try to stop, but if sort of, since the decision has already been made, they might actually make that movement. So anyway, that just gets into, that's really more about trying to time these things and trying to find ways for the researchers to get a glimpse or an estimate of when that decision was really made by that person, instead of their just sort of like overt report of that. But in the end, all I'm really trying to say is that we just don't know that if I think you're with the polling example, that's they might claim they don't know, or sorry, with the voting example, they might claim they don't know, but they probably really do know. But that doesn't mean they might, I still think they could change their mind hypothetically right when they go into the polling booth. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know what else to say about that. I'll leave it at there.
Well, it's interesting because it does seem that the art of advertising does exist precisely in order to try and sway somebody's expression of conscious will. But you made me think another question, Matt, which is based on sort of the temperamental aspect and sort of a legal aspect and sort of the implications of this sort of thinking if we want to constrain free will, which is if your consciousness is an expression of your sort of neurologically embodied temperament and you make decisions which we find, requiring of punitive action, like something that needs to be legally punished, are you truly at fault for that? And if we define, if your expressions of free will are based on the, that which is already grounded within you, you are that sort of creature, is that sort of, is that the thinking behind I suppose, like sort of fascists and their sort of programs where they're like, well, some people just don't measure up, and B, is that, I don't know, is that to some extent the implication of What is the implication
Well, let me.
of that legally?
I
Yeah,
have some thoughts. Actually, just I had something else, and I think either of you could discuss this or speak to this a little bit, or just give your opinions. I think it would be interesting. And let me take what you just said there, Alex, and sort of kind of modify it a little bit and throw it back in your court.
Sure.
So this just occurred to me, during this conversation, and that is, as you already mentioned, that if it was proven, if we knew that we did not have free will, again, that would call into question our justice system and what is moral and what is not. But in a way, hypothetically, let's say that is proven, that we don't have free will, at least in sort of maybe the conventional sense, this sort of conscious free will. But the issue here, one issue that is that we absolutely feel that we have free will. That is, you and I, there are crazy neuroscience cases where someone's, they don't feel like they're in control of their own arm or something like that. And that actually, those are case studies that I didn't look into that they might have been interesting in light of this conversation. But, we feel that we have free will. So even if we're told we're not, does it matter? So, if you have a justice system that punishes someone for what is considered bad behavior, and they are, it might be argued that they couldn't control themselves, but that person certainly did feel like they could control themselves. So, maybe it's, I guess it's sort of ironic to try and say, is it moral to implement, to have a justice system like that if there's no free will? But, what is morality if we can't, if free will doesn't exist anyway? But, maybe my point here is, you guys, I'll leave it up to you guys to discuss a little further. It seems to me that perhaps it's okay to have the sort of legal system that we have and the moral judgments that we have, even if we don't have free will, because that we all actually feel and believe that we do have free will.
Well, yeah. And I mean, it's very interesting too. I don't exactly remember the branch off which I came in order to think this, but to some extent, selection has, natural and sexual selection from a Darwinian sense has shaped our personalities and our expressions of our temperaments and sort of the boundaries of our free will, right? And culture has provided us with a much broader known territory, so we understand better the sort of social expression of our actions. And it does seem as if, sort of the foundation of education as well as the legal system is that we teach you all of these things so that you know them so that you can make the correct choices. And I mean, even the fundamental arts are called the liberal arts, those by which you free your mind. And so another angle I think I would like to come at this from at some point is to what extent, and this is something we've talked about before in our habits conversation, the building in of a massive network of skills creates a more adapted being to greater amounts of context, and thus you are a freer human in that you have a larger domain of competency or known territory. And to what extent that's also could be called free will or freeing yourself as a creature, and to what extent that is saying knowledge is power and that learning makes you more adapted to greater amounts of environments.
Yeah, actually, that's I'm thinking about it. Maybe it could even be the opposite.
Right.
So, in some sense, consider this situation where, again, linking it back to our discussions about habits, and we like to talk about motor habits because they're the easiest to understand and that we are sort of all in some sense familiar with personally. But the more you educate yourself, in some sense, you might have a wide and broad experiences. So you don't actually really ever develop singular habits that are bad for you. On the other hand, you might develop lots of habits because you exercise these thought processes so often that they become a habit. Once something is a habit, it almost does enter sort of like the unconscious. You execute and you don't think about it really.
Right.
So some sense, perhaps if you are highly educated, but especially if you are highly but narrowly educated, you are in some sense in the end, you have less free will for those things because you become a sort of stimulus response being when it comes to those types of actions, but not all actions necessarily.
Yeah, or your domain of action becomes so specialized that you exercise great freedom within that highly specialized domain, but you suffer from limited freedom in other ones. And that could potentially help explain sort of addiction or fetishism too, I imagine. That you sort of, your domain of competency becomes so small that you become smaller and smaller by just inhabiting that and not, expanding your range of consciously, developed habits, like ability to enjoy food and go out. If you're just a scientist looking at a microscope, just a stereotype, and you never go out and eat and you don't dance and you don't exercise, the world just gets bigger and bigger while you get smaller and smaller.
Right.
But yeah, no, that it does seem to be that I like that there does seem to be a compromise in there, and that you seem to be able to choose how well you build your habits in and in which direction you build them, right? If I want to be a baseball player, I'm going to build much different motoric habits than if I want to be a soccer player. We're going to play very different sports, though there is some crossover. And so if I do understand that that is going to limit my being to some extent, that almost makes me think that that's what Dante's idea of love is, or Aristotle's, that you choose some limited domain and then you get as deep into it as possible, because you can't have everything. You can't have full expression of the will, right? You can't be incredible at everything, sort of like childhood dream. But you can get increasingly free or good at expressing the form of an endeavor, or a single or a series of endeavors, right? Like you can become a great baseball player, but as Michael Jordan showed, it's hard to become a great basketball player than baseball player again.
Do you think education increases capacity for free will? Is that the path we're going on, or is it more just the idea that
I think it could? I think I think it could be seen in two different ways depending on the type of education you're taking on and what you're pursuing. So that's what I would say. Like,
let me just limit it to experience. Let's say that.
Well,
limited to
Matt, what do you
experience, just like life experience.
Yeah, well, just like so, for example, a child, right, a 5-year-old, is his capacity for free will different than a full mature adult?
Huh.
Right.
That is like Aristotle. Well, so how Aristotle, yeah, well, Matt, that's really interesting, Babcock. Matt, do you want to say the two ways you saw it first? Do those connect to
Oh, sure. Okay, so first I was thinking that as you experience more things, whether you consider that learning or just experiencing things, maybe, I think this is what you were initially saying, Alex, that this gives you a much broader context, options, or the domain to work with. And therefore, so I don't know if I would say it's free will. It certainly gives you more options, like a broader palette of decisions and actions that you could take.
Right. And just from a pragmatic angle,
I don't know. I don't know if anything really changes your free will, except that's where I was getting. Then the flip side of that, to answer Daniel's question, is what I was thinking about. If you narrowly focus on something, and not just narrowly focused, but repetitively focused. So maybe a scientist studying something isn't a good example, because they're always they're actually sort of building their knowledge base, right? They're just getting deeper and deeper into something.
Yeah. What about an expert concert pianist?
Right. So they're very stereotyped in their obviously actions, but also their thought process when they're playing. And so maybe they, in some sense, if free will really is, if we really do have some free will, perhaps in that domain, that concert pianist, after a lifetime or decades of playing, in some sense has lower free will. It might seem like they have a huge repertoire of things that they can do, and they do, but they actually may have fewer choices or decisions that they are consciously making when they are performing.
They actually do embody a form in the same neurological way that every concert pianist before them. That's wild. I never thought about it that way, but It's actually physical, because you build the exact same skills and you try and get to the same level as the masters, right? Which means you functionally, at a pragmatic level, spend as much time during the day. And that was sort of my comment about the range of activities. If I can do 15 things in the day and you can do 9, the question of free will seems sort of moot, because I do have more choices and therefore more free will by a pragmatic standard.
Right, but I guess that was my point in kind of asking about the capacity is just because I can make more choices Like, is free will can you level up in free will, or is it just this? Is it like just to use video game speech? Is it like getting speed boots? It's just like the thing that you receive at birth by being a conscious, rational human being, and it doesn't increase over time, but the possibilities with which you can apply that tool increases. It's kind of like I have a hammer, and that hammer is my free will, rather than the number of nails I have being the free will.
Yeah, and I definitely want to ask you, Matt, and maybe we can consider this in maybe the next episode, about studies on willpower too. Not only because I do think your domain of competency increases, and I think you use IQ to do that, or at least something that would suggest information processing over time, and rapidity with which you do that, and that and so just back to the willpower, just the idea also of what is willpower and how do people express it, like people who study athletes and like people who do incredible things, right? Like 100-mile marathons and stuff like that. Where does that come from? How do they do that exactly? Is it like a conscious thing they do, or are they just built to? And what does it mean if they're built to? Does that mean physically? Does that mean neurologically as well? Like,
I think both, right?
Yeah.
Well, I think that's you're right. We should probably, that's probably something we don't want to go down to deeply right now, but those are good questions, and we could probably have explore that down the road. As often is the case, there's probably a mix of things, both sort of genetic and nature versus nurture. But I do believe there's at least some neuroscience experiments that sort of address willpower or motivation that we could dive into.
Okay, wait. Can I give you a real time case study?
Go ahead.
Okay, so my dog just approached me. Right, she wants to be pet, but I know that what she actually wants is a treat. Right, because this is about the time I always give her a specific treat in the day. Mm-hmm. So, is that her will, or is she just responding to stimuli?
Tough one.
I think it's just stimuli, right?
Well, I'll say two things. Also, I wanted to come back to something you mentioned, Daniel, which is about the, does a 5-year-old have free? How does their they have as much free will as we do, or not, or is it changing? So I have a couple thoughts on that. But as for the dog, if we can't even decide whether we have free will, it's gonna be real tough to decide whether an animal has free will.
They do seem to be moved by motivational forces.
Well, and she and your dog, maybe she, I think perhaps to me perhaps more interesting is she aware that she's deceiving you or trying to deceive you? Or is she, and maybe this is part of your question, does she have the sort of free will or knowledge that she's taking this action with
or trying to get me to respond to stimuli, right? Like if I come over and get him to pet me, then he will give me what I want.
Right.
Yeah.
Sorry, but just to follow up then one more quickly with the idea of like, does a 5-year-old have more free will? Maybe I think that's an interesting question because, we develop and the brain goes through a development stage, a lengthy development stage. And it's somewhat, it'd be sort of easy to believe that, well, first of all, an infant doesn't have free will, like a just newly born baby, I would say has no free will. And as the child ages, they probably, if free will truly exists, they are probably accumulating greater and greater capacity for it, or ability for it. And part of that may be that of course, as we mature, we sort of our new brain can stop the old brain from driving all of our actions. And so the more and more we develop our sort of new brain, the neocortex, the more we can be, we're never really aware of our subconscious processing. That's why it's called subconscious. But we become more aware of our conscious processing, and perhaps that can put more controls, gating of the subconscious processes in some sense. So I would just speculate that if free will exists, it probably does develop over time. And,
well, that's precisely what Aristotle says. In his Nicomachean Ethics, he puts this as sort of a philosophical puzzle. He says, who has more potential, a boy or a general? And so he's sort of using a sophistical refutation here and using a word in two ways, right? Because a child has more potential to develop skill, right? And they have more neural sort of connections or pathways forming than they ever will at this time. However, they do not have as much free will if you manifest or you define it as the expression of skill, right? They have very few skills and sophistication of skills as opposed to an adult. An adult general, how much more can he do and make happen in a moment than a child? And yet, how much less of his brain does he use in doing that as opposed to a child learning? And yet, how much more is actually inbuilt within him that enables him to do the things he does, right? Like he can speak. That's something he had to learn how to do. He understands sort of the strategy of war. That's something he had to learn to understand. He can still think in an active way with all of that, all of those tools, right? And so he is a very different creature, has manifested himself in reality, even neurologically, very differently from the child. And thus, he can act in his acts have more power, and that is how you define potential in that way. And so I think that agrees with what you're saying, that as you develop over time, you acquire sort of the a wider range of abilities with which to use to act within the world. You become more adapted and more adaptable, ideally.
Yeah, and I still
might argue that it's like
sorry, go ahead, Daniel.
I was just going to say, it still feels kind of like a sword, right? That free will is kind of like a sword you can use, and a 5-year-old just doesn't know how to use it as well as a master.
Yeah,
that sounds right.
And that free will is sort of higher level cognition, cognitive processes, and not only just to use it, but also to guide or in some way modulate the lower level processing, the subconscious processing. And maybe again, we don't understand ourselves. We don't perceive our subconscious processing, but nonetheless, maybe the skill you've learned is, of course, a sort of, the general learns is a wide range of world knowledge that helps them in their, in battle and war. But they've also learned, like many adults, simply how to control their consciousness to prevent the subconscious from taking on most of the control of the body.
Right. Yeah, and that sounds like a good use of free will, or definition of it, perhaps, that it's not merely, but it is the conscious mind, not controlling, but managing the subconscious mind. I'm not sure how to...
Learning what's allowed to come through, and learning, that does seem to be what becoming sophisticated is, right? It's like learning how to articulate your aggression in a sophisticated way. It's not that you're trying to do away with it. It's just you need to filter it, right? You need to learn how to express it in the world. And so not repress it, but learn what is the what are the socially available options, and what is the best one for your current goal, right? Because
now can we take that and study the experiment itself, which claims that 10 seconds ahead before you make the decision, you've made the decision. Is there a potential that we perceive stimuli before it happens? Is that like subconsciously?
Well, remember, in some of these experiments, there are no, there are stimuli in the sense that they are watching some, and there are other experiments that don't even have this, but there are stimuli that they are seeing that are not meant to guide their decisions or their behavior. It's just to report the time at which the subject believed or felt that they had made a decision. But and in a way, I think I have a line in here under the criticisms. It's the last one there. Feeling an urge to act is an experience. It's not a decision.
Right.
So there's a challenge there. But the basics of the neurosciences are trying to say that yes, there was enough neural information, or information that could be extracted from the neural recording to not 100% of the time decide, in the cases where someone had to make a decision that is a right hand or left hand decision, they could most of the time predict what the subject was going to do. But that does not mean that the subject could have changed that had they chosen to change it, per se.
Well, that's pretty interesting too, because it makes it seem as if, insofar as you don't have a choice, that the world exists at the level of neural information, right? Because you are informed sort of by the environment in a way that it doesn't matter what it is you feel or experience. It's going to sort of report to your senses in the same way, which will then produce a sort of chain of thoughts in your mind, which will likely result in a habitual decision to act in the world. Mm-hmm. It's very interesting. It makes, neural information, instead of sounding like some intangible thing that doesn't exist, sound like that's what reality is actually made of.
And these things are, we don't know. We're not, they're not recording from every neuron in the brain, and they're not recording from, the fMRI is better, but it's still, first of all, this gets back into the sort of like the noise idea. So just because you see some signal there, that may be part of the process, but that doesn't mean it, and it's correlated with the decision that is made, but that doesn't mean it's the actual decision.
Right.
Perhaps there's other neurons that we're not recording that are better representations of sort of the actual sort of conscious decision, not unconscious decision. We have to just guess because we don't have enough experimental data to really give us the answers we might be looking for.
Yeah, and it's just so interesting to what extent this question is a question of, can you replace your sort of fundamental motivational systems? It seems like that's been answered. We're not a blank slate. We do have our motivational systems, and that's what psychoanalysis in the early 20th century sort of discovered, which we seem to remember but forget selectively, that how to manifest your motivational forces, especially the aggressive and sexual ones in society, is tough. We are very complex creatures. We have very complex social rituals. We are a very selective culture too when it comes to romantic partners. We in the West value monogamy. There's marriage. It's highly selective. It's not like with the bonobos, for example. And so how to manifest yourself as a physical being in the world, I don't think is an insulting thing about being a human, but is you are the most sophisticated animal, anthropologically speaking, that's ever existed. And so how to sort of manage yourself and, what you are, you're far more complex than a plane, a jet engine, by many orders of magnitude. That doesn't take away from what it is you're doing. It adds to what you're doing. You're a physical being in the most complex social unit that's ever existed. And yes, you're responsible for that.
We'd like to, we like it or not, we are often held to be responsible for that.
Right.
So,
right.
But we have no choice. We have no choice in that matter. We have to do it.
Well, guys,
but you know what? Something just occurred to me. I don't know. Maybe our time is getting short, but I did just think of some other a style of experiments. I'll just relay to you guys that I think is kind of interesting. There are other types of experiments where they demonstrate how it's not really about free will. These are stimulus-driven experiments, but it's more about how our subconscious brain filters out information. And so in some sense, you can't have free will if the subconscious is preventing you from perceiving some realities of the world, because then you have limited, at least it's reducing your free will because you are limited into your perception of the real world. And so one clear example of this is where we have binocular vision, we have two eyes, and if you show two different images to the two different eyes wearing special glasses and whatnot, it is really, it's effectively impossible to perceive both those images at the same time. And what you might perceive is one of those images, and then at some moment in time, suddenly you perceive the other image, and it may go back and forth. Or you may just consistently just perceive one, and obviously if you have one eye that's stronger than the other, that might be a factor there. But they've done, this is sometimes used as in other experiments to sort of show what someone's bias or subconscious might be doing. And so as an example, I'm sort of making this up, but there are, if you show a heterosexual man two images, and one is an attractive female and the other is a house or something, they will almost always perceive the attractive woman. They may not ever perceive the house that's in the other eye.
That's the point the Matrix makes with the red woman, right? Like the things that attract you.
Oh, yeah, right.
Right. So our subconscious is sort of making those decisions for us. And, we just have no control over that.
Yeah, interesting. Except for insofar as how we deal with that, right? Like it's like we
Sure.
we can't not notice what it is we notice, but we can sort of choose how we manifest the behavior that is predicated on the presence of that stimuli.
That's a real, again, this is a stimulus-driven sort of experimental paradigm, and it may be not at all a good reflection of sort of our free thinking thought processes and free will in that context. But to add to that, Alex, it's but if we know, we recognize that what we perceive may not be the entirety, and we therefore sort of search our space mentally or physically for other things that we should be paying attention to. That's hopefully good for
well, that's interesting because that seems to be driven by selection as well, right? The framework of values that predicate that which we will explore for in an environment. It seems like we've got a beat on that, right? We've got a working market economy. Like we know what we want from each other very well. Mm-hmm. We're very good at that. And so it's interesting to what extent we ask philosophical questions, but a lot of those philosophical questions I think could be answered in the way that we're trying to answer them through data. It's like, well, let's look at what we actually make, and then we'll understand the sorts of creatures we are, right? It's like, look at what we're motivated to do, right? Like we like to go eat with each other. We like to go physically, exert ourselves. Like we have replicable behaviors that you could list anthropologically alongside like Homo species, definition. Right. And we have large amounts of data that now show this sort of thing. And it seems like what we're trying to get at here is this seems to be, if we're going to try and answer these questions, this is a really good direction to take. And I think we did some good work today. How about you guys?
Yeah, I had a good time.
Did we resolve it?
I mean,
I think we got it.
Yeah, we nailed it. It was as good as it could have been, right?
I think just about no free will in the matter. It's definitely as good as it could have been.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Babcock, it was great having you on. We might have to have a part 2 of this. Keep throwing out those questions whenever you listen.
I will. I've been pretty busy lately, so I haven't been listening, but I will try to catch up.
Yeah, and I didn't get the listeners.
Keep the zingers coming.
But yeah, you are a teacher, and I know it's an important and big time of the year. You're an English teacher, and so you're probably grading essays just about every moment of your life. So have fun.
Well, it's been more like I had 2 weddings to go to this weekend, so it's been more real life things to deal with than.
Speaking of motivated behavior, wow, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Yeah, well, we went to again on an interesting note that could itself be the fount of its own conversation, and so I'm looking forward to that. It was great having you both on. I thought this was a great success. And
is this new software you're using?
Yes, this is the Zoom software, and it's now professional, and I now pay to use it. So
wow! How much do you pay?
It's $15 a month, and so we're going to think about doing a fundraiser to get pay the $130 to get the discounted rate of $30 off for the yearly package. So down from like $150 for the year or whatever it would be to $130, and so that might be interesting through the Anchor donation app.
How many listeners are you getting?
We're getting about 32.2 listeners per episode right now, and we recently doubled our listeners from 500 or listens from 500 to 1,000 last month, and we're already up over 1,300 this month. And these Consilience conversations, people like them.
Have you thought about getting like editing software and stuff like that?
Yeah, we're getting there, and we're talking about getting an advertising intern as well as an audio editing intern. Ideally, somebody who could do both, right? Because we're so small time right now.
Yeah.
And but these are the questions we're having. We look at the analytics. We look at the days we're big, the days we're small. We look at the times that are good to release these pieces of content. And we, there are definitely days when people like to listen to podcasts.
Yeah.
Sundays can be big days. Tuesdays can be big days.
I think editing is going to be helpful. And I'm not saying that to suggest that like this isn't useful, but like I think about podcasts I like to listen to. I prefer ones that are like a constructed narrative that I'm going to listen to for a certain amount of time. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think that'll it's like easier to package it. I think, like if you could condense it down and like, like think about like Malcolm Gladwell's podcast, right? I mean, it's like he has interviews, he constructs a narrative, and it's like he's basically telling me a story rather than just a conversation that I don't really know where it's going to, like it goes in all sorts of directions. And my point,
we could have a podcast about narratives and the neuroscience of narratives.
It's a thing. Well, but I mean, we've talked a lot about stories and how like that's how the human brain learns is through stories. That's the whole sort of the purpose of them is to teach lessons. And so it's like, today's topic is free will. Well, what's the story of free will, right? So, like we kind of covered it in this disorganized, which is totally fine for our conversation, but disorganized way. But if you could construct it into a narrative, it might be easier to follow the flow of what actually we covered. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And, temperamentally, how one goes about sort of conversing, with the big 5 trait model, those open to experience, those with like sort of the creative intellects that like to make free associations while conversing. I think that's the sort of conversation that we pursue here, like a literary.
Yeah.
And, there are a lot of people that do this too. Ben Shapiro, Joe Rogan, Jordan Peterson.
That's true.
The old Aussie prime minister. Like, to some extent, I think we're trying to transmit a bunch of information all at once, and that's our goal, rather than having a specific moral message.
Right.
We're just trying to throw it out there and make a lot of connections, and hopefully it hits home and can be helpful with some of the contemporary questions that people are asking, and some of the perennial questions too. So like sometimes we talk about the politics that are going on, and that's about to get really important over the next couple of years. And I think data will be really important. But then like today, talking about free will, we're also showing that I think we're willing to engage with the hardest questions and show why they're serious. And I think because we're taking them seriously, that it helps to re-embody those questions or those sort of values that we've had forever, and that we now have good evidence for why they're important.
Well,
I do agree that the narrative is also good.
But your goal, part of your goal, as I understand it, is to have an organic conversation in which people may be willing to step out on a limb and say things that are truly on their mind without having a sort of a packaged agenda, or you can edit it, and it is easier to go through if there's a real tale to be told there, a narrative. But that can sometimes also seem artificial, as if you are
that's a good point. It also
the producers to some final thought process.
I was just going to say that's sort of a different project, I suppose, than what you're really going for, which makes sense.
But I do think if we if we keep doing this and we keep loving this, and this is something we talk about, and we wanted to say package this for massive consumption, and we wanted to do a 12 lecture series, and we wanted to lay it out, I think telling like the story of the brain or something like that would be the right way to do it. I think you are right that would be sort of if we were going into production for something, that would be something that a consumer would expect.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was. Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking.
That is interesting to what extent a consumer expects narrative built into their product, right?
Right. Yeah, I was thinking not replace this, but supplementary. Like as this grows, could you develop into. I mean, because you have so many subjects that you're targeting right now. Which is cool.
These are our initial forays into unexplored territory. Yeah, but each of those sort of arrows we shoot into the ground, we expect to look into those areas with greater focus as we move forward. We're just sort of, I think we're defining our scope at this point.
Yeah. Have you branded a production name? Like, have you come up with like a company name?
I'm talking with Wes about that right now. We're talking about logo, and we're talking about getting some materials together before we go to this conference in March. And so we're getting pretty serious about that. So it's taking shape, and I think that's the right question to ask. I mean, at the very least, on Facebook right now, it's called The History of Western Thought, and I'm just personally
Oh yeah, that's right. I forgot you had that. I deleted my Facebook, and so I've totally forgotten all these things.
Oh yeah, well yeah, as now an old person who uses Facebook, yeah, we have about 600 followers there, and that's pretty cool.
Yeah. I know I just forgotten that you had that name. Yeah, that's right. I remember now.
Yeah, well, for the listeners, Mr. Babcock's over in Michigan, so he's in the middle of the country, and it can get pretty snowy there. And so, without Facebook, it's like, where does it all come from? Well, you can get it from YouTube now, and we're going to put up some more data there so you can keep up with us.
Yeah.
Us coastal.
The great white north.
All right. Well, I think the conversation after the conversation was just as valuable. The meta narrative, as it were.
Yeah.
Well, guys, should we leave it there?
Sounds good to me.
Sounds good, Alex. Yeah.
All right.
Thank you.
Yeah, and a little bit longer for everybody because there were 3 of us. And so, a nice holiday treat for everybody. And if they need to get away from the table for an hour and 15 minutes to listen to some intelligent conversation, well, here it is.
All right, well, you guys enjoy your turkey and your football.
Likewise.
Will do. See ya.
Bye-bye.